Hi, and welcome to my channel. Today I'll be building another microscale general store. I say another because I built this same kit a couple years ago for a different client. This is their Pine Creek general store, and it's a wonderful kit to build. So in this one, we'll have some different colors, but many of the techniques are the same. So I'll skip through some of the basics and just hit the highlights. This is what the kit looks like when you get the box. And this is everything that comes inside the box. It's quite a bit of stuff to work with, and you have this wonderful set of instructions that come with it. I start by spraying the foundation a gray color. It's supposed to represent cinder blocks. Then I glue two corners of the foundation together. Then glue the entire foundation into one piece using the subfloor. And you also put together the subfloor for the rear extension. And now it's time to start working on the walls. What I like to do is use an X-Acto knife and cut the ends of the clapboards. And these really show up once it's stained and painted. Then I started using my Ultimation slicer to cut the bracing for this kit. I didn't need to brace it quite as much as I sometimes do, because it's going to have a middle floor that will help hold the walls together, and also it was going to be assembled before I put any stain or paint on it, so there's less chance for warping. So once I put some of the bracing in place, I started gluing the walls to the floor. This operation goes pretty quickly. Everything fits together pretty well. And you can see there the second floor glued in place that helps hold the walls pretty straight. Then after bracing the clerestory walls, I like to sand the bottom of them at the correct angle for how they'll be sitting on the roof. This makes them sit flush. Then I went ahead and glued two of the sides and end walls of the clerestory together. Then I glued the walls of the clerestory together, along with the walls of the rear extension. Then I glued the roof supports in place and glued the subroof onto it, and you can see why I sanded the bottom of the clerestory here. It makes it fit flush. Then I went ahead and put in place the subroof supports for the rear extension. Now I like to put a room divider in the upper floor because you can see through the windows, and this keeps you from seeing all the way through. Then I glued the subroof onto the rear extension, and I did the same with the clerestory. Now my client wanted it to look like this photo. It's kind of a brownish grayish siding with green trim. So I had done a few tests, and I started out by putting a driftwood Hunterline stain onto the entire building, and I'd come back and put a paint over that once it was dry. And in the meantime, I cut out all of the windows. These are all tissue castings that come in the kit. And I taped them all down so I could airbrush them. Before doing that, I did a couple color tests to find which green matched the green in the photo the best. I ended up using this Vallejo Lufthoff green, and I thinned it down with some airbrush thinner and then sprayed all of the windows and doors with it. Now it was time to mix up the color for the siding. I used a couple different shades and added some thinner to it, and it ended up coming up as this kind of blah beige, which once I started brushing it on over the driftwood stain, came out looking perfect. I used a dry brushing technique so that I didn't have full coverage. It looked like the paint had been fading some. Then I went over the paint with a couple other stains, lighter at the top and darker at the bottom, and I was really happy with the results and how it came out. Now I could glue the rear extension of the building onto the building itself, and I clamped that and let it dry, and then did the same, gluing the foundation and floors onto the building. And now I used the sponging technique to add some small amounts of gray paint onto the windows and doors to give the effect of peeling and fading paint. and I was happy with how these came out. And now I glued the acetate in place using a thin glue and letting it wick underneath it. Now one thing I like to do is mix up a very, very thin brown paint, and I'll go over all my windows with this, especially getting it in the corners. And then once it dries, you get very good looking dirty windows out of this. Now I started on some of the other trim. I went over it with the same grayish paint that I had used on the building. Then I went over it with a little bit of sandpaper to roughen it up so it looked like it was peeling. And this gave me a pretty good effect, especially once I went over it with another batch of Hunterline driftwood stain. Then I started gluing this trim in place, first using it as corner trim. I trimmed it on the clear story so that it would again sit flush on the roof. And then I started gluing the corner trim onto the main building. The kit also comes with some shade material, and I just cut this to various sizes and glued it onto the backs of my windows. Now I started on the front of the store. These are tissue castings, and they give you the angles that you need to glue these together at. I used my sander to get the proper angle on the pieces of casting, and then used a little angle guide to glue them together in the proper orientation. When I had built this kit previously, I made a little jig to hold all of the various pieces at the proper angles and let everything dry so that it'll fit in the opening properly. Then once I had glued it all together, I primed the pieces and went ahead and painted them in the same green I had used on the windows. And I painted the underside of the roof and all of the roof trim in the same grayish color. One thing I like to do with roofs that are going to have rafter tails glued in place is to mark out where they're going to go while the roof is still flat. It's easier then. Now for these kind of paper shingles, I like to use Copic markers to make random marks on all of the shingles. And then once you use the two-sided tape to glue them down, you get a really nice variety of colors on your shingles. And this is a test fitting to see how they look on the building. I now went ahead and glued all the windows and doors in place in the building. Then I started on the tar paper roof that was going to go on the rear extension of the building. For this I just painted it a couple dark shades. Then I glued them in place on the rear roof and used some sandpaper to roughen up the edges of them. Then I glued this rear roof in place on the rear extension of the building. Then I turned it over and started gluing the rafter tails in place. Then once that glue dries, I use nippers to cut them flush with the edge of the roof. Then it was time to glue the main roof in place, and I just used weights to hold it in place while it was drying. Now one slight problem that I expected, I had run into it in the previous kit, was the rafter tails don't fit over the windows. So I had to do a little trimming to get them to fit. But it wasn't difficult, and there was only a few of them I had to do this too. So they're all glued in place and trimmed as well. Now I started working on some of the details. For the lamps, first I bent the wire, and then I had a lamp jig that I'd made years ago, and that holds tissue lamps in place while I glue a wire onto them. I use super glue to attach the wire, and then once they're all done, they're ready to paint. What I like to do is spray paint them all black at first. And then I'll come back and I'll use an off-white to put inside the reflector of the lamp. Then after that's dry, I'll come back and use a couple shades to rust them, with a light rust inside and a dark rust on the outside. Now it was time to glue the clerestory in place, and it sit nice and flush because of the sanding I had done. And I kept weights on it while it was drying. Now I added some of the trim around the front entrance and windows, and I painted, rusted, and glued on the star bolts that come in the kit. Now it's time to work on the concrete base. I used a camouflage khaki to start with, and then hit it with a couple various shades of gray for variation. And then holding the base flat, I glued the building onto it. Now working on the chimney, I had a couple small cracks that I had to fill with putty. Then I used my sander to shape the top of it so that the smoke outlet would sit on top and fit. And I used a knife to open it up a little bit so when you were looking into it, it looked like it was hollow. Now I had painted this cinder block chimney gray, and then I used a wet distress crayon to come along and add mortar in between the cinder blocks. And by rubbing it on and then wiping it off, you get a nice mortar effect on the chimney. Now I started on the loading docks. First I stained the supports and the loading docks themselves. Then I went ahead and painted the supports a concrete color. And the loading docks came with a piece of wood that was supposed to go on it, but I preferred to use individual strips of strip wood. So I cut them to the proper length, and then I stained them a variety of different shades. Once the stain was dry, I glued those pieces onto my front porch, and then I went over it with a grayish stain that blended it all together but left some variation. Now I started on the side loading dock, and I did the same thing, cutting my strip wood to individual lengths and staining it a variety of different colors as well. This one would come out a little bit different because it was going to be used differently than the front porch, so it would have more wear. Now in order to glue the chimney in place, you have to cut away a little bit of the roof section. Once I did that, I glued the chimney, making sure it was perfectly vertical. Now I started working on the steps for the loading docks, and I used a couple stains on those for the supports and for the treads. Then I started gluing them together. Now one of the details that came with it is a hydrocal vent. After opening up one end of it, I put a pin in the other end, and this will make for a strong attachment once I glue it on the building. Now it was time to start painting some of the details that are going to be attached. I first sprayed them with the silver, then went over them with a variety of rust shades. And then I glued two of the vents onto the roof of the rear addition. Now I started working on the roofs that go over the loading dock. Again, you have roof material and a framework for it. And then for these roofs, I used tar paper strips, again sanding the edges of them before gluing them in place. And this gives for a very worn look. And these are the supports for those roofs. And after staining them, I started gluing them in place, using a 90-degree angle to make sure that they were all upright and a spacer to make sure they were all spaced the same. And once I had these all glued in place, it was time to glue them over my loading docks and front porch. To prepare for this, I put a ledger board over the loading dock. The trim over the front window would work for that. Now you also get support wires and turnbuckles, and I like to drill the holes in the roof that they're going to go through before I actually mount them. It's a lot easier. Then supporting the building, I glued the roof over the front porch and let it dry. Then after the front porch roof has had a good long time to dry, I put it on its side and glue the roof over the loading dock the same way. Then I come back to the roof support wires, and after painting them, I glue them all in place through the holes that I've drilled in the building and in the roofs. Then after they're all glued in place, I'll come back with some rusting colors and add rust onto the wires and onto the roofs and the walls where they're attached. And now we can add some more details to the building. I glue the porch lights underneath the porch roof, and then glue the lights over the loading dock and on the other side of the building in place. And the kit comes with some nice electrical boxes and insulators and some hookup wire. So I paint that. The electrical box we're going to use on this one is the more modern one. Then for the conduit that goes up to where the wires attach, I use a pressure sensitive adhesive. This way you don't get any glue squeezing out when you glue it onto the side of the building. Then I ran some wires from the conduit over to the insulators. Now I started working on the signs. We were going to have a lot of general store signs. I printed them out and then started rusting them using a sponge. And then once I cut them out, I like to go around the edge. You can use a marker, but I like using a wet weathering pencil. It doesn't bleed as much. Now it was time to start weathering the building, and I like to use artist pigments for this. I have a variety of brushes and colors that I use for different areas in the building. And one thing that I have to add is a vent pipe for the plumbing. If you have any building that has indoor plumbing, you really should have a vent pipe on the roof. So after drilling the hole, I glued it in place and put a little gallery glass around it for sealant. Now another thing I like to do if I have my building attached to a base is grind up a bunch of dried oak leaves and then sprinkle them around. It shows the kind of debris and leaves that you would get collecting around the base of a building. And you can do this on your layout as well. It really adds a nice little touch. Now a couple of things that I worked on but wasn't able to add before the building was done was all of the detail parts that come with it. I primed them, and I also made a couple of signs for him to consider. But I had to deliver the kit to him because of where we were going to meet before I was able to add all these onto the kit. I'll be sending them to him later. So this shows the kit as it was done when I delivered it. Again, it still needs all of the detail pieces added, and I'll have a link that goes to the previous kit that I built where all of those details are in place. But this was a very fun kit to build. I like any of Microscale's models, and I have a couple more that I'm hoping to get to soon, and when I do, I'll get videos of them up. Thank you for watching.